USA, the ID3 is verboten. You can't buy one. That's despite the fact that it's one of Europe's best-selling electric vehicles, and it has led the leader charts here at points through its lifetime. Volkswagen have just announced a refresh of the ID3. At a couple of years old, it needed a few nips and tucks to stay as relevant as it could be in the marketplace. But you, our viewers, have asked us so many times, when is the ID3 coming? And Volkswagen still say no. But the question is, could it work in the USA? I'm not in the USA right now. This is sunny Cornwall, and this is an ID3 first edition. So high spec model, it's got all the gadgets inside, but still only a 57 kilowatt hour battery. Is it any good? Could this car work in the US? Well, let's take it for a drive and find out, because it turns out if the ID3 won't come to Kate, maybe Kate can come to the ID3. The ID3 is definitely my favourite of the ID group of vehicles, which is so much of a shame because I can't have one. But it feels a little bit lighter, the motors feel better matched to the size of the vehicle. I'm not saying that the ID4 is bad, it is not, it is a good car. The ID5, I'm sure, will be a good car, but this, it just feels like a vehicle that was designed for the MEB platform. And I know they are all designed on the MEB platform, but this, you know Goldilocks, this one is the right bowl of porridge. It doesn't exactly feel like a Volkswagen in oh so many ways. The trim materials aren't fabulous, they're a little bit scratchy. The cluster and the gauge, they're wonderfully clear and simple, but they don't scream Volkswagen at me. And the capacitive controls, oh god, the capacitive controls are annoying. Honestly, they have got to go, and I know that some of them may have gone in the refresh. It was announced while I am here in England, and I haven't had a chance to look at the details of that refresh. But the capacitive controls I understand here in the cluster are staying, which I think is a mistake. The capacitive controls on the steering wheel, I hope, are going. I haven't had a chance to check that because they are so annoying. I found that I have initiated the voice command so many times when I've been driving. I've had random sets and resets of volume and changes of function just because I brush against it, happen to knock it enough, and it thinks that I want something to happen, which honestly I do not. Most of the time, I do not. But in terms of the way the car drives, it soaks up the bumps pretty well. It's a little harsh in some situations, but it's very well balanced. And the cabin feels light and airy. There's lots of room in here. Of course, one of the benefits of it being an MEB platform car, a car designed to be electric, is that the battery pack occupies all that underfloor space. It has a really snub nose, and it means that despite this being a kind of mid-size car, you get a lot more legroom, you get a lot more space in here, and it really does feel quite capacious given the size of the body. But that can at times be let down by the software. Now, this has had the updates applied, so when these cars were first introduced, it is, I think, fair to say that they were pretty well hammered for the software implementation on the vehicles. And look, I'm an Acorn fan. I remember Arthur. The first Acorn Archimedes I used had Arthur, and it was not good. And this software, when it was first released, also not good. Now, it's okay. It would not be my favorite. It's not my absolute choice. It's a little slow at times, and it still feels a bit clunky. Most of the time it works pretty well, and I haven't had any problems with it other than the intermittent interruptions. The interface can be a little bit grating in that it tends to announce things like, please drive in the middle of the road, which I know that's phrased quite politely, and the little chime that it uses does make me think of an aeroplane and long journeys, and it's not wholly unpleasant, but there's usually a reason if I'm not driving in the middle of the road, particularly in England, where some of the roads are pretty narrow, and this vehicle, while it is not as big as many vehicles in the US, we need to be shunted over to the left on the single narrow lanes to make sure that the other vehicles coming the other way don't hit us. And having the car both complain at me and try and nudge me in that direction, kind of irritating. You can turn off the lane centering, which is what was trying to nudge me towards the center, but having that little announcement, I just like that, is really kind of annoying. Thanks for doing that though, Volkswagen. It was perfectly timed. So, I'm not going to go into details. We last year reviewed the MG ZS EV, and I know some people were upset because MG did not give us a car, so it was a rental vehicle that was a couple of years old, and it wasn't the current version of the MG ZS, which I realise now some people felt disappointed by. This is not a review because I am driving the previous generation as of a few days ago, the new version with the much updated interior, the updated trim. Presumably, I'm hoping that they will have updated the charging. This is the first edition, so it has the faster charging, although despite being capable of 100 or more kilowatts, I have never seen more than 70, which is probably an aspect of the weather. It has been pretty cold while I've been here, and also an aspect of the fact that this vehicle does not have battery preconditioning. An unfortunate omission, particularly when driving in cooler weather. It certainly meant that my charging stop was a little bit slower than I would have hoped. And yes, it was one charging stop in my 200-ish mile drive. This vehicle has a 260 mile WLTP range, but WLTP is, shall we say, more generous than the EPA cycle, and you would expect to get about 80% of that on the EPA cycle, which much more closely mirrors the kind of results you'd expect to see in real day-to-day driving. With that being the case, it is winter, and I have not seen more than about 180 miles range out of this vehicle, which is not bad, it's not excellent, and that is from a full charge. So, that brings me to the question, the big overarching question: could a vehicle like this work in the USA, or indeed in other countries with sparse populations and spread out charging infrastructure? One of the things that people often ask us is why Europeans buy smaller vehicles. And, well, I think this answers that question, because in many bits of Europe, if you want to go somewhere and you want to be able to go anywhere, then what you need is a smaller vehicle, because if you try and drive something large, i.e. larger than this, then you're going to find that you are limited. You can't go everywhere that you want to go. And to be honest, there's not really a great need for larger vehicles. Most people, 95% of the time, do not in fact need a huge vehicle. Although I will say that driving this through the town of Foy is abjectly terrifying, even though it's not that big. Because, I'm gonna be honest, it's a rental car, and you know, if I scrape my own car, then never mind. But if I scrape this one, then that's a big bill. So let's not do that. Foy, incidentally, very pretty. But that brings us to this big overarching question. Could a vehicle like this work in the US? Could a vehicle with a 57 kilowatt hour battery work as a daily driver in the US? Or indeed in other countries with sparse populations and spread out charging infrastructure? And I think that really depends. I think it depends on whether you are using the vehicle as a daily driver to go hundreds of miles. In that case, I couldn't recommend a 57 kilowatt hour battery. This vehicle is going to struggle to do those kinds of distances, but there are large parts of the US, Australia, there are large parts of many African nations which have significant urbanization, and in those areas these kinds of vehicles are just fine. I am not going to want to drive this car every single day a distance of thousands of miles. It's going to get old pretty quickly. But am I going to use this as a daily driver to commute to work? Sure. Could I use this comfortably in the area which I live? Absolutely. And is it a reasonable size for the US? Well, that's where the question really lies, and I think that it is. I think if you look at the population of vehicles that are around, that being mainly vehicles that are a few years old, there are a hell of a lot of saloons that are not dissimilar in size. The good old Toyota Camry, which is one of the US's most popular vehicles, is really, once you take into account the fact this is an MEB vehicle, it's designed as an electric vehicle, and you have that extra space given to you in the interior and in the trunk, because the vehicle does not have wasted space, then yeah, it's a really similar interior cabin size. And that's something that I think US automakers really haven't pushed, because they have spent many years trying to train US customers into buying the biggest vehicle that could conceivably meet all of their needs. And it's very disingenuous, I think, at this point, for them to turn around and say, well, consumers don't want smaller vehicles, because they've spent years telling consumers they don't want smaller vehicles. So now, at this point, as we try and move to electrification of our fleet, as we try and encourage people to consume less, as we try and be more efficient with our use of resources, this is the kind of vehicle that you could use in the US, and it could be a comfortable transition vehicle for many people. This vehicle starts in the UK at about £39,000. That's inclusive of the 20% value-added tax. If you take that off, you get about £31,000, which in non-Pobble-Bead economy is worth about $35,000. $35,000 is not a bad starting price, especially if Volkswagen chose to start building this. in the US. If they did that, it would be eligible for $7,500 of tax credit. And that could be a really good vehicle for us to be seeing in the US. I don't think Volkswagen have any intention of doing that right now. I don't think that they see this as a vehicle that fits the US market. But the US market is not as homogenous as some would have you believe. Many of the people who watch this channel, many of the people that I talk to on the street, they wish that there were smaller options in the USA, and they are frustrated with the fact that SUV after SUV is what gets offered to them. For many US people, it's incredibly frustrating. As a bastion of consumer choice so said, it must be galling for many to see so many vehicles being sold outside the US that never ever make it to the US shores. Vehicles that are smaller, vehicles that are more efficient, vehicles that could cut drivers' costs. So I hope to see this there. I truly think that the Volkswagen ID3 could be a really popular vehicle. Not a massive seller to be sure, but certainly in the Pacific Northwest, in the Northeast, and down along the whole of the West Coast. I could see this vehicle flying off dealer lots, and maybe they'll choose to do that in a few years' time. Maybe with the refresh they could be encouraged to submit it for US crash testing, or I have my endless vague hope that one day we'll get homogenization of homologation, that we'll get the same standards required in Europe and US and across Australasia, but I'm not holding my breath on that one. Perhaps the best we can hope for is that the US will one day accept something like single vehicle approval so that individuals can import the vehicles that they actually want from other countries. And if we could get a few people doing that, then we might start to see Volkswagen admit that there is demand for this vehicle. And maybe, just maybe then, we could see it in the US. But what do you think? Should the ID3 come to the US? Let us know in the Discord chat room. Now, normally at this point I would cut to myself stood outside the car and read off our Patreon subscriptions. But, one, I'm driving, I've still got a fair distance to go. And two, we've had a whole bunch of people join. Thank you so much to everyone. So I'm going to cut to myself back at home. And on that note, we're done with today's video. If you liked it, you know what to do, and feel free to tip us with a super thanks, or indeed a Ko-fi or Bitcoin. Our Discord chat room is open for your thoughts, link down there. If you want more, subscribe, hit the bell, and follow the links below to regularly support us with a YouTube membership or Patreon subscription. You'll also find a link to our swag store, and check us out on Mastodon. We have our very own server. Scrolling by on my right is our list of amazing charged up supporters, and shout outs go to our self-driving tier supporters: Alan Tupper, Andrew Martin, Anthony Coates, Bennett Elder, Bill Kelly, Brian Newton, Brophy Wolf, Chris Maxwell, Krista Center, Cyprian Laplace, Dan Blair, David Janakula, Danny Hyde, Gordon C, Guido Drahota, Hey Esker, Jim Burness, John Trammell, Kyle Fox, Kyle Hodgson, Lance Shall, Linda Irish, Mark Eggleton, Michael Goad, Mike Weeder, Paul Nelson, Pedro Muro Pinheiro, Peter Dillinger, Regine Fellows, Ricky Leong, Sean Tucker, Tesla in the Gong, Tobias Stroh, Tony Moss, and Zachary Courtney. Finally, out of this world, thanks to our Starman supporters: Aaron Han, Andrew Glenn, Blue says hello, Christopher Jones, Clay Witt, CPU Freak 101, Dave Kitchen, Ellery Hensley, Eric Knack, JP Fagerback, Joe Bresney, Joan Hughes, that's Joe, not Joan, John L. Henderson, Kevin Burbridge, Marcel Ward, Matthew Drobnak, Nigel S., Paul Conway, Reggie Watts, Robert Flannery, Rory Litwin, S. Bowen Zenna, Stephen O'Donoghue, Will Graylan, and of course Ian. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined us recently, even if it makes my list hard to say. We'll be back soon with more videos, but until then, keep evolving.